Africa. So unfortunately, the search committee for a new director, is scheduled at this time. But we will be sharing with our colleagues the gist of what has taken place here. Now, this is a moment to step back, and my presentation today really is within that mode of stepping back and being able to reflect on what is happening globally, what has been accomplished in Africa, and what the potential for the American Academy, and of course in this case Northwestern, to contribute in positive ways to understanding those very complicated dynamics, and to be able to discern ways in which we could have a positive impact. So this presentation is really within the mode of a period of reflection, and reflection in which I am going back, and you will see mention of some of the ways in which I have been involved. I call myself a scholar activist, and that's what I have been from my student days to the present. I have some research assistants. Two of them are here, Sam Lerner and Jude D'Alelio, working with me. And one of the things we've been involved in very much has to be in Nigeria, but also I'm going to be exploring ways in which we can work on this project going forward. Democratic realism is a term that came to me. I'm not going to be, if I were to go into talking about what I understand about it, it will use up all our time. But I will say that I had to look it up to Google, Monsieur Jourdain, who discovered that he had been speaking prose all his life in Molière's Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme. Well, I have been dealing with democratic realism going all the way back to my experiences in Nigeria in the late 70s, and Nigeria was transitioning to a democratic system. And the question was, how are you going to produce a democracy given the realities that I was learning about in Nigeria? And in fact, the first chapter of a book I published then, I have a series of books here, but my book on democracy and prebendal politics, the first chapter is called Making a Democracy Work. So let me proceed. We've circulated this abstract, and this presentation is going to follow the abstract fairly closely. The global power has been altered in significant ways. The reconfiguration of power occurred in Africa. By the way, what really triggered the start of this work, I was invited by a journal called La Vanguardia in Barcelona to write a follow-up to a piece that was published in 2011 called Democracy and the Reconfiguration of Power in Africa. So they asked me, and it really started me along these lines. The democratic upsurge I mentioned, the things that have blunted it, and then I'm saying understanding these dynamics are essential today. Some of you will be familiar with this book by Robert Farris Thompson, Flash of the Spirit, which I happen to delve into. And he's a longtime professor at Yale, writes on African and African American studies. But he started off in his preface with this Yoruba proverb, Ibi kan ki sigbo, and it means one tree cannot make a forest. And what he was saying was basically, that he's a scholar, a leading scholar, but there are all these others, who are responsible. But the more I thought about that, the more I thought, well, it doesn't really quite capture what goes on. And this is that there's a series in which an ongoing process of trees leading to forests, leading to trees, leading to forests, leading to trees. And that you must have trees, in other words. And, I'm just reading the Nobel Prize. So these are just some of my publications. And by the way, a lot of this work is going to be for my own purposes. But as I was going through thinking of it, I kept thinking of the ways in which, either I was able to step forward or I was able to bring people forward. And that, some of you here obviously will be able to continue. Now, the issue of global disorder, and in fact, I only discovered that the reason where it came from in my mind was this article I read by George Soros, where he had used the concept of global disorder. I won't be reading through all of these because you all will be able to read them through yourself. But we do have a sense of disorder, but I don't think disorder quite captures it. And I'm going to try to, go a little further than saying, things are disordered. By the way, this one here, my wife and I, Jennifer, who's present with us, we're in Sarasota, and I go down to Walgreens to get my newspaper in the morning, and I opened it, and there's all this stuff, and I, just saying, oh my goodness. And the Walgreens clerk, said to me, the world is falling apart. I said, I'm going to be quoting you, so there we go. All right. Policy puzzles. I get the term age of disruption. Those of you who haven't seen that Ivan Krastev's recent op-ed in the New York Times, I find he's one of the more insightful people talking about the situation in Russia. And even just this morning, a very good article tracing what Putin is doing all the way back. But it ends with this statement that boldness counts for much in this wild world. And so Putin being able to step forward and with the kind of boldness, and of course we have a president right now who he's always been a cautious person, and now he's deeply cautious. And of course I cite Abraham Lincoln about being able to think anew and act anew. These are trends. I call it trends and terrains since 1989. Again, I'm not going to read that list for you. You could sort of look through it and be able yourself to see what very important developments that we have in the world having to do with the exercise of power. The erosion, I'll just cite some there, erosion and recomposition of nations and states. Things that I've only discovered recently. I didn't know anything about the dark web because I'm not involved in the kind of thing that goes on in the dark web. But I was really surprised to find out how much of a dark web there is and what actually takes place there. But please feel free to to ask me about anything that I have listed here because, like I said, basically it's for my own purposes of organizing some of the thoughts. By the way, after this piece that I'm doing for a short essay for L'Avant-Garde, I'm doing a longer piece now on democratic realism, possibly for the Journal of Democracy, and I hope a foreign policy piece. Many of you might have seen this photograph from the Taliban in Kunduz, but I don't know how many of you noticed something that really stuck out. Two things really popped out from me from that. An Afghan soldier there, but as you see, we have a smartphone, but also those two young people in the picture. I mean, the photograph itself, And then global and national dynamics. Again, I'm not going to go through all of these, but really understanding some of the complexities. Now, some of you were aware I taught at Dartmouth, and then I went off with the Ford Foundation in West Africa. And then I was recruited to join Emory and worked at the Carter Center. And so from 1988 to 1994, there was a period of these transformations that were taking place. So I had the opportunity to do that. But the universalizing of market economies was really part of this post-1989 experience. And then recently, we don't know how it's going to come. I hope it's going to move ahead. Yeah, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is another effort. But all of these trends that we are seeing, all these issues that we are seeing, which are both global in nature and also which we presently have in African countries. Right? And it's very important to be able to look at not just the national dynamics, but really how they're being affecting some of these global trends. Now, with regard to policy optics, Gideon Rose, he's the editor of Foreign Affairs, and they had a recent issue dealing with President Obama's foreign policy on various regions. And so this was his overview article. And he ended it referring to saying that time generally on the side of the liberal international order rather than side of its few remaining enemies. And, you know, for me, there was a certain kind of optimism that we see among some of our leading foreign policy thinkers. Many of you will be familiar with the work of John Eikenberry, who is a person who has perhaps most written and advocated about the liberal international order. Joseph Nye, these are people who have been through here with his particular vision of the global system, very pyramidal in terms of it. And then recently, Robert Kagan was at the Chicago Council. And he had a book recently written called The World America Made, and he made a presentation on the American leadership of a liberal global order. And Brian Hanson and I, in fact, we found ourselves just trying to get Kagan, who's at Brookings, to really deal with the fact that, you know, there's a certain complacency here about the liberal international order, and that the situation is much more contested. I have a word here, it's a bit of an ugly word, but sometimes, you know, you don't get a mellifluous word to describe something. I call them multicracies, in other words, that we now have multiple configurations of state regimes and so on in the world, in terms of what is being contested. Tom Friedman, he had a very nice article, but he ended up by saying that we should size our rhetoric with our interests. And then the question, well, what exactly are our interests? And which is the rhetoric that's really going to correspond with that? So I'll just end here with this particular side, saying, yes, there's a sense of disorder, but I also think there is what I call disorder. In other words, that there are orders, China, Iran, and Russia in particular, I'll mention those, for whom their projection is very much centered on dissing what they see as this liberal order. And they are, you know, they're very determined about it. By the way, earlier I had a piece from Krastev about East-West dynamics. He said it's no longer East-West dynamics, it's now all these things. Well, we still have East-West dynamics, right? But the East-West dynamics have really been able, post-Cold War, to reconfigure themselves and appear. And then finally, reconfigured autocracies is what I consider to be one of the, and I've written about this in the Journal of Democracy, that in many ways the reconfiguring of democracies is much more dynamic right now than what we see in a number of democracies. The issue, as I mentioned, of thinking about the reconfiguration of power in Africa, and I was sent back, and you'll soon see it in the next slide, by an article, concerning Russia and Africa, is the fact Achille Mbembe, who will be known to some of you, and is very close, academic but also personal colleague, And he had written an essay in the journal Africa Demos, bulletin that we published at the Carter Center when I was there, in which he said, well, people are talking about democratization, but it really should be looking at the recomposition of power. So he was bringing forward a skeptical view. I mentioned Adigun Agbaje here, and I just went back, and I brought a booklet here called Africa Democratic Perspectives, which was published in 1996. Carnegie had given me some money for some work we were doing, including Africa Demos, and we had a set of evaluative essays by African scholars, and Agbaje was calling attention, to the fact that we have to be a little careful. In other words, there is this democracy wave, but we're not really dealing with the essence of some of these changes taking place in the continent. All right? So these are all the other things, the things that have been written, but it really is wrestling with this idea of democracy promotion, but wrestling with democracy promotion in context in which you have a lot of countervailing forces going on. Now, what really took me back, Peter Stavrakis, who's a scholar of Russia, and in an article, in fact, this was a report done for U.S. government, 2002, but then he updated it in 2015, and he was talking about what was going on in Russia, and talking about, with Putin and so on. But what was very interesting for me was that he went back and he was citing some of the work that had been done in Africa. And he's the one, by the way, who sent me back to looking at what Mbembe had written, and then, ideas that I myself, in terms of presentability. And I will, by the way, this is from my professor, Arthur Wilson at Dartmouth. And when I was a student there, he used to do his class with a great pile of books. and he would, as he lectured, he would pull out the books and show them. But anyway, this volume that Mark Feinsinger, who's a Soviet scholar, and East Europe, and Crawford Young did some years ago, has turned out to be extremely important. Talking about it. But anyway, the fact that in thinking about Russia, that scholars on that, what is happening in Putin, are really looking to some of this writing, that my colleagues and I. Now, the best here, the next few slides I can go through fairly quickly, and this is really, over the last 25 years, what has really happened. We've had a democratic upsurge. I'm saying, and those of you who are able to keep up with, for example, Freedom House, which comes out every year, showing the progress of democracy in the world, and being able to show that, democratization is basically stalled in Africa and so in terms of the numbers. But my sense is that the numbers really do not really only get us so far. And I will describe the situation now in Africa as a mosaic. I mean, we've had that mosaic before, pre-1990. I think we've now got a new mosaic in terms of the nature of regimes. And I'll just single out here some significant factors, and in fact they'll be mentioned in this piece I'm writing called Abangadia. Delayed democratization in Nigeria is very important. Right? Nigeria is one of the very 4.5 people of sub-Saharan Africa is a Nigerian, one of about a little over 5, and so on. And the fact that Nigeria in 1979 really was poised, in fact it had initiated a democratic republic after a very complex process. And the fact that the military came back in after that government was renewed. And since then, the fact that Nigeria, perhaps it's only now, might really see sustained democratization in Nigeria, I think has been very important for what is happening. I think South Africa, MIA means missing in action. South Africa has been missing in action post-1994, right? And the expectation of what South Africa was going to be, it has not been, and we can talk about that. And then Egypt, this incredible Egyptian pivot, where we had, this amazing transformation, and now it's now gone back to this extremely repressive regime. In terms of democratization, I've already said that in the piece having to do with Huntington, that in fact we're not talking about waves of democracy. I mean, it's a metaphor that Huntington used and it was helpful. But democratization, when you look at where democratization has taken place in Africa, even right up to the present, there are conjunctures, there are particular combination of factors that take place in particular contexts that we can talk about, whether it's Mali or Senegal and so on. And then there are alliances. And these are really ad hoc alliances. I call them posses, you know, from the old Western movies, where they round up a posse and they said, let's go. All right? We have posses being formed in particular situations, and we could talk about it in that regard. And then finally, this competitive clientelism and political settlement. For a couple of years, I was hanging out a lot with the development economists, the Stiglitz School of Development Economists, finding out what they were thinking. And, you know, this is the way they talk about, you know, they have to talk about Africa, and they said, well, basically these regimes is competitive clientelism and political settlements. And so I sort of said, what are they talking about? Until I realized, well, it makes sense that they're really caught there, you know, these terms, you know, in terms of discussing these regimes. So authoritarian resurgence, you know, there are the countries, there are the experiences, you could read them yourself. Authoritarianism, unfortunately, has been very resilient in Africa, and we could talk about all the different you know, aspects of it. And then state failure, another fact, there are the countries, and they're all with us, all of them, right? And recently, as you know, the United Nations has made this major commitment to peacekeeping. You know, just recognizing that, you know, what is going to be needed. And then jihadism, again, which has been a factor that has come about. Again, you'll all be aware of it. This here, Abdul Muttalib, who in December of 2009 tried to, or came close to blowing up a plane over Detroit, all right? And from Nigeria and everything. So much has changed, and so much more would have changed if this didn't happen. We came so close. You know, and every time I go into the airport and they have one of those things, those big screening, it's Abdul Muttalib. All the billions that has been spent now to screen our whole bodies, all right? And then, of course, Boko Haram. There it is. Governance and state systems. I've been talking, you know, I was talking to Professor Beenan before, and hoping that you remember the major conference that we had here in about 2005, around it, 2004, 2005. These are some of the just important body of writings that have taken place on this. And I really feel like, you know, state governance and development. You know, I look at all these, you know, up on the wall, all these things, and maybe before long we'll have something to say, state governance and development. And I'm just showing you some of the incredible, you know, work that we have, many of us have studied and so on. You know, Prof. Young, the post-colonial state in Africa, fantastic. Fukuyama has really impressed me a lot. This is a slight book, slight in terms of size. Robert Cooper on the Breaking of Nations, but again, capturing, you know, these tendencies that we see. Some other scholars, again, that are very important to this thinking that we have. Our own Rachel Reed, who can be here, because she's now in France, and the work that they've been able to do. Bo Rothstein is a scholar, a Danish scholar, whose work has a great importance to me in terms of this thing. All right. In terms of focus, the Nigerian experience. In fact, I was telling Professor Beenan, I just sent off a letter this morning because I was, a list of scholars I've been involved in. But the Nigerian experience is one that I think could be a focus of a lot of our work. I have, my research assistants there who helping me put together, and I hope, to produce that long-promised second book on Nigeria. Africa Plus was created. I put up the names of the undergrad researchers who have worked with us on that. And you can go to that website. You can see the contributors that to that to that site, to those discussions. And again, it's we've been having these conversations. And again, the point is these conversations that have been taken online in a number of ways, being able to bring them together here. Sahelian Africa is another possible area of focus, for an initiative here. Already, Rachel Riedel, Heine Menke, and French International Group, they've started a project on security and stability in the Sahel. But the Sahelian region, that region, just between the the grassland and so on, and the more desertic areas of Africa, is an area of a great deal of security and instability. In fact, I wrote a piece for Brookings in which I talk about this arc of insecurity and instability. I see that as a great opportunity. The humanities, have to be brought in, and I'm glad to see some of my humanities scholars here. If any of you happen to get up to New York in the next, few months, there's an incredible exhibit there on power and majesty in the Congo, right? And you just have, and this is the Congo with a K, referring to people covering a whole area, and the importance of the cultural production in Africa, and as it relates to this. But again, we could take that up. I think of Northwestern and the opportunity for global policy scholarship, and with regard to Africa, I really feel like these, I put it up here, a lot of opportunities that we do have. David Brooks recently worked about classes organized around the challenges students would face in the first decade. I think it's going to be short, I would say, the next 5 or 6 years after graduation. But again, here are things that I think we have strength, either present or potential. The Adigun Agbaje, I went back, I mentioned, I looked at this essay that he had written for African Democratic Perspectives. The second quote here is what I've already said, that in democratization is an appearance in many cases. But what he had to say here about the workaday meanings of democracy and democratization is something that I have, but let me just mention that it really was brought to my attention much more critically in a conference in Lagos in 2011, in which they were talking about my work on prebendalism in Nigeria, but where you had the anthropologists present, some British anthropologists, and the research that they had done based on different Nigerian communities, right? And the kind of thinking that people involved in terms of their own cultures, their own things, at the, as it were, the base of the pyramid, and realizing how vital that is in the kind of work. But I'm just putting up there to show you that our scholars were already calling our attention to it. Again, getting back to Policy and Scholarship Network, from Northwestern, my office is a house in the transportation department, and so I see people doing all this incredible work, and I think of the transportation systems in Africa, and I just think, oh my goodness, how could it? But look at all of the things that we do have, and just thinking of, boy, a way could be found in which some of these, incredible strengths could be tapped. Next steps, and this is my last slide here. I'm hoping that we could get a Buffett working group started. We initiated one, a year or so ago. We ran into some, a few roadblocks, but we're ready to do so again. Put together a research proposal. Student research is very vital to me in terms of my teaching, in terms of the students who are able to work with me. We already have Africa Plus as a network that could be expanded. That is just my own courses that I'm teaching this spring. I'll be teaching a course on democratic realism. There are a number of courses I've teaching, and who's democracy and democracy development in the new global economy. I'll be pulling it together in a course. And then a course I taught my first course for the School of Professional Service, used to be the School of Continuing Studies, and that was on Boko Haram in Nigeria, but I'm going to do one of the Nigerian experience. Finally, fall 2016, the conference, I just put the title up there, but my colleagues could decide, but we really need to have, I think the time has come, to have a major conference again. And then finally, Northwestern and the Nigerian Academy. Just this morning, a colleague of mine, Professor Ayo Olukotun, who runs a very important listserv, and he publishes a weekly column. And his column this morning, and the theme he keeps bringing up over and over again, is what had happened to academics in Nigeria. What has happened to the university? What has happened to intellectual production? And so on. And so I have, I immediately responded, and then I started going over in my mind, the ways in which, because, we have had Nigerians here. Professor Kai Fayemi, who's just going to be one of the ministers here, he was a visiting scholar. John Payton, who is the leading American expert on northern Nigeria, was here at Northwestern, and on and on and on. And so, and that's just the Nigerian Academy, but the ways in which the kind of reflections and research work, writing and so on that has to be done, how we could contribute in a more deeper, more continuous way to our cause. So thank you.